Scott, you're good to go.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Moffat. We're Cornerstone Education. I'd like to welcome everybody to our next presentation. Tonight's guest speaker is David Latourelle, who's the Director of Safety and Transportation with Paraco Gas. He's going to talk about storage tanks, what we can expect when we're inspecting a home, what to look for. And I'll turn it over to you, Dave. Thanks for coming.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time here. We're looking at this presentation as it came out of an earlier presentation. I guess it's maybe a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months, Scott, where we presented in Connecticut, and we thought there might be an opportunity to share some of this information with a larger group. Scott, just help me out real quick. Is there a geographical specific area with Cornerstone training, or is it Northeast, or is it nationwide?
We're covering about 14 states. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, right? I mean, we have coverage within 14 states, whether they're on live or they can see us again in the future. But I think we're up to about 14 we're approved for now currently.
Okay. Well, and the reason I asked that
would be Northeast. I believe Florida, New Mexico. We have out west and stuff. So we're kind of all over the country.
Well, in an effort to try to personalize this a little bit, I had to sort of preface that, because one of the main things we're going to be talking about is what is the input, I guess, or the impact this group could have as part of their inspection process for their customers to see if they can provide some value add. So I guess we'll start off with the fact that in regards to what the expectation is from the home inspector and what are the opportunities here, what was really clear is the fact that, there's limitations to how much information you can share, how deep you delve into codes and regulations or what have you. So taking the feedback from the last presentation, I think it's important to sort of talk about the fact that there is I guess we'll call it a national reference called the NFPA 58, which is the Liquefied Petroleum Gas Code. It's very closely mirrored in a lot of ways with the International Fire Code. So depending on what exactly is the authority having jurisdiction in the areas that you're operating can factor in here, but we're going to stay kind of on I guess we can call it the national level. But I guess I'll preface this training tonight in this training is the fact that we'll try to share the basic information, but it will be something that may have to reference back locally, because the one thing about the authorities having jurisdiction at the local level, they do have the potential sometimes to make the rules more strict. They just can't make them less strict. So we'll focus on the starting point and go from there. So we'll try to make it as relevant as possible here. So in regards to the propane installations, I think there's two potential areas that this group, could benefit from in trying to share that. And the first one is primarily going to be the exterior propane installation where the actual container is. I think there's a little bit other opportunities potentially on the inside of the house, although, again, the expectation isn't that we're digging for every fault or every issue. It's about what is relevant and what is the initial important part in regards to the safety of the system, as opposed to the compliance and the code compliance. But in regards to the industry, an installation for us is based on it's installed so the customer is safe. Obviously, as the employer that's going to be returning these locations to actually fill the propane containers or do some of the work potentially on the plumbing side, depending on the jurisdiction. We want to make sure our employees are safe while they're conducting those repairs or those fills. And obviously, because we're talking about propane, which is a liquefied petroleum gas, it is flammable. That is the benefit of propane is it provides alternatives for heat in people's houses or residences, but it also provides many other potential opportunities in regards to cooktops, water heating options, dryers, fireplaces, and some outdoor products as well for the patio with barbecues and a variety of heaters type of deal. So when we think about the propane industry, depending on which part of the country you are in, and us being based here in the Northeast with Paraco Gas, the focus generally starts with the fact that propane is used for a heating, primarily for heating, and competes directly with, obviously, with the oil industry, heating fuel oil industry, and the natural gas industry. But the natural gas and the propane industry gets to do more than the oil industry because their focus is primarily on heat and potentially some hot water, depending on what they're using for their heating appliances. The gas options are a little more extensive, which means it may be a little more higher presence and more plumbing potentially in some of the houses you could be inspecting. So we'll come back to the interior towards the end of the presentation because it's a much more, I guess, for lack of better terminology, a regulated industry on the plumbing side, again, depending on where you're located. But in regards to what I think can be the most productive for this group, what we found successful, and Scott, you could echo this if you choose to, was talking about where the container is installed on the outside of the house potentially, and whether there are a couple of quick eyeballs that could say, hey, that's something that maybe needs to be verified or looked into as you're making the decision based on the inspection and potentially for the potential homeowners that are requesting it. So, and the last point here on this slide was the fact that long-term sustainability, again, that's an interesting topic right now as we talk about fossil fuels and the environment we're currently in. But what was meant there was the fact that once, because it is a competitive industry and there are multiple options, the initial install may move from different providers, and there's all these changes that are happening. I don't need to explain that to this group. You guys, get to definitely see the fact that people make changes within their house, whether they do it with permits or not, and depending on who the contractor or the do-it-yourselfer is, it probably leads to some of the things that you guys get to call attention to people as you do these inspections. So I guess real quick, I'll check. I assume there won't be any questions yet, but I'll just give it one quick second to see if there is.
I think we're good right now.
That's what I expected, but we'll give it a shot. Okay. So let's see. All right. So for those of you that may be familiar with the National Fire Protection Association, I'm assuming there's some overlap there, but for our industry, when it comes to NFPA 58 is primarily what we would consider our Bible. It covers just about everything in regards to what the propane industry does, both at the installations as well as to service those. You'll notice on your screen I've also included NFPA 54, which is similar but not the same thing. It's the National Fuel Gas Code, but that's going to regulate everything basically inside the house. Technically, it's going to be everything downstream of what's called the second stage regulator. And that is usually going to be at the entrance point of where the plumbing transitions from the exterior of their house potentially into the interior. So we're going to focus probably today mostly the presentation based around what information is found in NFPA 58. And for those of you that just like to have that background information to support your opinions or your findings, just wanted to share that. But again, as the bullet says here, this is going to be considered a guideline that's been adopted through the internationals and a lot of the state codes and some of the federal regulated codes. However, as you continue down from federal to state to city to town or jurisdiction, there may be also some local regulations that you may want to be familiar with if you want to really go forward. So that's the primary function I wanted to share with you from a communication point. The next slide that I put together originally was focused up in Connecticut. So it just sort of referenced the fact that even though NFPA 58 and 54 for that matter are on a 3-year revision cycle, it's a little more often than the International Fire Code. They try to strictly stay on a 3-year as well. But again, just an example, even though I present in Connecticut, I'm actually based in New York, and New York chooses to rewrite, essentially, or I guess better choice would be is to reprint the International Fire Code, but put New York State Fire Code on it, put the current governor on there, and charge a lot of extra money. So
They're good to go.
Dave, who has the final say? You know, the local building official, the state, you know,
it's usually,
NFPA?
ultimately, it's going to be the local building official. Again, depending on your jurisdiction, that may be a fire marshal or a fire district office potential. But again, it will boil down to the authority having jurisdiction, but it will reference back usually to these codes unless they've actually upgraded anything in their personal codes. So 58 and the international are probably on the average is going to be reflective of what's in your areas. However, again, depending on exactly the areas that you cover, you may want to stay in step and in line with the local building inspector and department to see if there's any changes to that. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So enough about the background. I guess it's time to try to get you people a little bit interested in it. So when it comes to containers, you can find them up against their residence. They may be separated from the house, and some of them may be underground. And those are potentially looked at in 3 different ways through the codes. And even though this is a little bit of a busy slide, it was kind of a summary slide to take us in. And ultimately, looking at the top right of your screen, real quick, when you see propane containers that are up against a house, the containers that you see in this picture are known as DOT 420 cylinders, or they're called an ASME 120 gallon. So I think using the gallon numeration is easy to start off with. These containers you're looking at have the capacity to hold up to 120 gallons of liquid propane. However, all propane containers are filled to, as a rule, only to an 80% level, because there always has to be room left in the container to create the vapor space, because obviously it is the vapor that is transmitted through the piping system that can be flammable at the appliances in question. So again, not to go too far into it, but we started this presentation talking about propane, but the proper terminology for propane is liquefied petroleum gas, because it is going to exist in a gaseous state to be flammable inside these containers. However, because of the pressure of the container being closed and separate from the atmosphere, it does allow us to keep the liquefied petroleum gas propane in a liquid form above its boiling point. And we're not going to turn this into a science class, but just to give some perspective, propane boils at minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. So obviously in the natural environment that we exist in, it wants to exist as a gas, and it actually wants to mix with air and oxygen and actually dissipate completely the environment if it isn't in the combustible stage. So the way these containers are set up, these containers are the largest containers that could actually be set up against a house. So as the inspections are being completed, if you're doing an exterior inspection as part of it, if the application is on a smaller house or less appliances, you may readily see containers in the perimeter on the 360 of the house. And if it is, that gives you an opportunity to gauge some of the real simple and important separation distances that the industry has to follow. Now, for larger containers, and again, I'm not going to go overboard here, so you have a couple other slides to create the visuals. Larger containers will start to move away from the house and may be very visual in a lap around the house. But again, the reason the larger containers separate is just with that thought process that more potential flammable materials present, therefore creating some separation to try to prevent something that could be detrimental or catastrophic if for some reason the propane system allows the propane to escape other than how it's supposed to. And that is ultimately where the plumbing fits in here, is that from the propane containers through the regulators and the pipe to the point of the appliance, the propane is never really exposed to oxygen, therefore it can't combust. It can combust at the point of the appliance. However, as with any plumbing potential, if some kind of a leak is developed, depending on where that propane can go, leads to some of the stuff that unfortunately occasionally shows up in the newspapers. It's an incredibly safe product, an incredibly regulated industry, but of course, I hate to say it, but when you involve humans, there's always the potential for a mistake or what have you. So that is where the ultimate objective of all these safety regulations come in, is to try to prevent something catastrophic from happening. So before we jump into sort of the next slides, which are a little more specific, I will focus us again back to the live picture on the top right-hand corner. And what it's quickly just trying to talk about here is introducing the fact that if containers are up against the house and they're very visible to you in your inspection, the primary things that people are going to look at it from a perspective of if it's a proper installation is primarily that if it has separation distances from potential sources of ignition. And that's the legal way of saying anything with a spark. So the definition gets a little wider, but when we talk about the exterior of the house, potential sources could be generators, anything that has a small engine motor that has an open spark, potentially any electrical fixture where, and primarily is going to be a plug, an outlet. If appliances can be plugged in or out, you're going to create a spark, obviously, when you finish those connections. So depending on the locality where we operate, a outlet is considered a potential source of ignition, then needs to be separated from these containers by 10 feet. And that's in every direction.
A switch, a disconnect, electrical disconnect or switch.
Correct.
And even a meter, electrical meter, any of that stuff.
So you jumped right to the one of the hot topics. So thanks again. Electrical meters, the electrical meter to the house is a wide open interpretation across the country. Some areas consider it a source of ignition. Others consider it not to be because of how it actually functions. However, there's been a lot of change in the meters over the years. So the fact of the matter is when someone asks that question, if you boil it right down to what the lawyers will interpret it, no one wants to make a full interpretation on it. However, I can tell you for a fact there are some states and some fire marshal authorities that do recognize the electrical meter itself as a potential source of ignition and won't allow a installation nearby. But it is varied across the country without a doubt. So one other point before we move on here, you'll notice the arrow here was pointing towards this ignition source, and it's tough to sort of see, but what they're trying to demonstrate there is that is going to be a termination for some kind of a direct vent appliance. And because the application of those type of appliances result in a negative pressure to draw in outside air into the combustion chamber and then discharges the products of combustion through a similar discharge that's going to be probably covered by that outlet, direct vent appliances have been included to be, I guess, within the definition of an ignition source. So that's become a very interesting topic in our industry. Because you'll notice here, they also talk about openings here on the bottom right. So I think since you already sort of piqued the curiosity there, Scott, going to one of the hardest questions, so thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next slide because I think might be a little more productive to talk to this group with a little better visual. So without trying to give anybody any I guess, motion sickness, for lack of a better term, I'm just going to quickly show that there's basically 3 slides here in a row that look somewhat similar, but they are actually used to distinguish between 3 different types of installations. And the first one we're seeing here are primarily what's called DOT cylinders. And the only reason I bring that up is because of the idea that liquefied petroleum gas is being delivered primarily by truck across highways at the end of the cycle here. The DOT will only allow containers up to the size of what's called a 420 pounder, or essentially 120 gallons, to be transported over the road, filled to its maximum capacity. So they're considered, in their eyes, a portable cylinder that can be removed and replaced or filled on site. So they've used this here to sort of talk about the two separation distances, one being a source of ignition. And they've also talked about this definition of what's called a building opening, because they look at the definition of a building opening as if it were able to allow an exterior gas, propane in this situation, if it was released for some reason, to enter into the confined space. That's where the definition is. So when NFPA 58 was putting together a visual to make it simpler than using just all the lawyer speak, they were very good at sort of choosing air conditioners as their visual example of a source of ignition. And you'll see in this picture, they use both a window portable unit as well as a central air on the two sides of the picture here. And they use basically basement window or crawl space openings to simulate what they consider a building opening. And I will just tell you for a fact that having done the training in the propane industry for the past 15 years, when we start to introduce this concept to new employees and sometimes some more experienced employees, we find they leave the training, they're experts at noticing air conditioners and basement windows. But go back to the fact that they're using those to demonstrate the two definitions here, which is source of ignition and building openings. Because, for example, if a window doesn't open, it's not a building opening. A source of ignition or a direct vent appliance, and they notice they use source of ignition on the right of the screen for the where the window air conditioner is located, and they used an intake to a direct vent appliance right above the central air compressor on the left part of the picture. They're trying to get a variety of information into these visuals. But for this group, I wanted to start with the source of ignition as being the priority, and that's usually going to be a 10-foot sphere, basically in any direction, and it's usually measured from the specific valves around the containers, but we're not going to make this a propane class today, so we'll say from the container, a rough ballpark of 10 feet in any direction, basically 360 degrees. Within that sphere, there can't be any of these small engines or these direct vent appliances. Termination.
David, I can tell you it can be a real challenge, because I just had whole house generation put in last year, and we had two 120 tanks put in, and the wife wanted them in a certain area, and the town was like, no way. And the propane people came out and the generator people came out, and it just could go in one spot because of that 10-foot rule. And it can be challenging because of all the openings and everything.
Right, and there's some other limitations in regards to the propane company has to be able to reach it. Now, again, generally the propane company is using 150 to 200 feet of hose from the truck, but that creates some challenges as well sometimes because, as you said, some people focus on the aesthetics of it, which, again, we all recognize that. But there are some rules and regulations, and again, for the containers that are going to be against the house, the 10-foot separation becomes, a little bit of a challenge. But interesting enough, these building openings can be a little more challenging. But people don't necessarily know all the rules with those because they're actually measured from only one valve, which is the relief valve on the top of the container. But for the sake of tonight's conversation, we could say if you take the top of the container, the building opening restriction is actually going to be on a horizontal plane directly across from the top of the container. And then it's going to make a 90-degree turn and go down. So it's actually not in all direction. It's actually from the point of the relief valve, which will, for today's conversation, talk about the top of the container. It's going to be from there and lower, and an extension out of 3 feet for DOT cylinders. Now, there is overlap between what's called a DOT cylinder and the next slide, which are going to be what are called ASME containers. They're very similar. Most people can't tell them apart, but there are some differences on them. So for those containers that aren't regulated by DOT, it's actually a 5-foot separation. So experts, are going to know the difference between 3 feet and 5 feet. But a rule of thumb for this group may be to focus initially on the 5 foot. And if that's clear, you're good. If it's less than 5 feet for one of these potential building openings, and just to talk about building openings, here they're using, basement windows. It could be dryer vents. It could be other appurtenances that actually go through. And again, in the situation here with the direct vent appliance, it may be outside of the 3 foot rule, but you're still looking for those type of openings because, again, they may apply to the other definition with 10 feet. So it is a little bit of an interesting, but just to use a great example, you talked about cogeneration. And looking just at that central air compressor, the HVAC companies are, I'm not going to say notorious because I don't know exactly who's on the call, but again, their focus is going to be where is the best spot for them to put the central air compressor. And it's not uncommon for them to punch them out and not realize there are some limitations of where they can be with the propane container. And it may not be discovered until the propane company shows up to fill the containers, and all of a sudden there's a brand new central air conditioner or some cogeneration system that's been installed that is a little more involved than potentially thinking of moving these containers. So I think this slide does a good job of trying to introduce the concept for you. That, again, these are the containers that you're probably going to see most often because they're going to be potentially right up against the house. The third slide, which I'll just jump ahead to, talks about underground containers. And again, they have a separation distance from the house, which then makes the separation distances from the potential source of ignition, obviously the building openings, moot because they're usually far enough away. These may not be as evident to find. And again, if they aren't evident to find, then you're not as concerned about that potential safety feature as it regards to the most basic. Because I guess I forgot to sort of mention here, I talked at the start about how we want obviously to be safe for our customers and your customers. The second point, I think you remember I mentioned that, employees that come to work on these. I guess what most people don't realize, and I probably should have introduced, is when the propane company comes to fill these containers on site, one of the first things they do is actually open up a small orifice on the container to actually gauge the fill. So they're actually releasing propane during the time they're there when they're filling the containers. So that's another reason why these separation distances are set up, not only for when we're not there and if anything were to potentially happen to the system, but while we're there actually doing it, the industry standard is to release a small amount of propane as part of the process. So that's where we don't want it to travel to a source of ignition while we're there, which again may be further than the 10 feet and these building openings and traveling inside. So the undergrounds are probably not as applicable to this group as part of what you're looking for because it won't be as visual, but I wanted to just sort of introduce to the fact that, again, there are containers against the house. There are larger containers moved away from the house, depending on the size, and it's the smaller ones that can potentially stay up. And this is where this container, this visual starts to show, again, these separation distances. And I'll just sort of reiterate the fact that if containers that fit into these larger than what they call right here, 125 gallons, they have to move a minimum of 10 feet away from the house. So now the building openings kind of, the 3 foot or 5 foot rule is obviously moot. It doesn't necessarily completely eliminate the potential sources of ignition, whereas anything that's a source of ignition on the exterior of the house, like an outlet or this intake to direct vent appliance, is likely going to be 10 feet away. But again, remember some of these other appliances like generators or air compressors, they're not necessarily on the house. So there might be something that is apparent in a walk around that says, hey, I remember taking that one class talking about a 10-foot separation for source of ignition, which is probably the highlighted one from this presentation, and it may give you an opportunity. So,
Dave, I don't know if I'm skipping around. On an underground tank, I know that oil tanks have had issues with, corrosion leaking.
Yep.
Is that any kind of worry about a propane tank?
So It's not as prevalent because the construction of the containers are much more significant than the oil containers. The second part of this is that if a container were to start to leak, the propane is actually going to dissipate to the environment. It's not going to saturate the soil and create the cleanup issue. So it isn't in the same level as the fuel oil. However, when people don't recognize what they're dealing with, the first association may be to say, well, what's the difference? Propane's like oil, therefore there's a problem. But there isn't a containment issue or a requirement with undergrounds. And it's actually not regulated by the EPA in regards to a groundwater contaminant, because it's going to find its way either out of the ground or up into the atmosphere. It's going to mix with air and it's going to dissipate and completely disappear. As long as it doesn't collect in a location and potentially find its way into the flammable range and find a source of ignition.
How about protection on those, Dave? How about protection, the tanks? There's certain areas they cannot. I mean, if you're at the mercy of the house and you can't install it because you're close to ignition source, when you install them near driveways if you had to.
Well, right. So, yeah, the trump card is going to be the source of ignition, the building openings. As you move towards potentially a driveway, vehicular barrier protection may come into play here. But, yeah, there are a variety of options, and there's different engineering controls that can probably provide an option for everything here. So, and I think what may help if I just move along here, just to give you an example here. So here, talking to that picture there, Scott, on the right, this was someone's intent to think that, hey, even though I've installed these underground containers, those green domes are actually almost like a square garbage can going down to open up to the cluster of the container. So those still have 10-foot separation from a source of ignition. Someone decided to install these heat pumps. And even though they don't have the 10 feet, they just decided to build this small retaining wall because obviously the propane, being heavy in air, isn't going to travel over the source of ignition. I can tell you that probably wouldn't carry water in most of the places I operate in. So again, you may go out and find insulation that may have been approved by someone who didn't know the regulations, because this little retaining wall or decorative wall placed in front of it doesn't satisfy the definition of the code. But the picture here on the left is an example of the propane container, and just looking at it, it was probably there before the heat pump and potentially the central air conditioner looks like there. But they were installed in a convenient location, but now they've placed the propane tank's ability to be filled out of compliance, and to be quite honest, unsafe.
And that's probably, the contractor didn't pull permit, because if he did, obviously the building official would point that out, right?
Potentially.
More than likely.
But here's an example of doing a home inspection, doing a quick walk around. Again, these are a little bit extreme, but this doesn't look right, does it?
No.
When we go back to, the visual of, you want some separation distances here. So,
hey, David, we have a question from one of our attendees.
Okay.
Is there a minimum clearance from a tank to a deck if a tank is, located under the deck or?
So, as it was always when we try to put down rules of thumb, there's also the gray areas. So it depends on the authority having jurisdiction, and I'll throw out a couple things. Is the deck considered part of the building? Some people may say because it needs a building inspection, the outside line of the deck may be considered the outside of the building, and they may want to try to build that separation distance as the deck. Across a couple authorities having jurisdiction where there's a code that says you can't have collected or stored combustible materials stored around the container. And the code was set up that way to talk about you don't want to store firewood or scrap lumber, but somebody said, hey, if a container's up against a deck, isn't that flammable materials? So generally, my response, based on what the code is not intended to use the deck as part of these arguments. However, the local authority having jurisdiction may be able to pull them in. So I have to leave it a little bit open there.
Okay, thank you.
I can tell you there are a lot of installations out there where propane containers are right up against a deck. And I know some have had to be moved away from decks. So it can be a challenge. All right. Thank you for the question. I'm sorry I can't give you a yes or no answer. Unfortunately, being in the codes and compliance avenue, I rarely ever get to answer yes or no, but I will do my best. So to move to the other side of it here, talking about building openings, these popped up as a pretty good example, and I guess I will mention here, right, is here's most of the logo of Paraco, so I'm an equal opportunity offender. I don't call out just our competitors, I call out our own challenges, because what happens is there is a lot of transition that goes on in the industry as well. We're looking at containers here that were either installed or purchased by Paraco, but in the pictures here, you're seeing some sort of a ventilation opening, probably to a boiler room or a mechanical room. On the top right, what's indicated there is what could be, it was more than likely is going to be a dryer vent or some sort of termination, but you'll also may notice the plywood that's down below. The question is was that an attempt to eliminate a basement window and a building opening? However, potentially that termination there could be a dryer vent, which is a building opening. And looking on the picture in the middle, you have obviously a potential opening. Now again, there's a window there. If that window doesn't open, then it's not a building opening. So it's not about windows. To the left of that container are the Bilco doors that are going down into the basement. So right now they are closed. However, they were probably not hermetically sealed. And whenever that Bilco door is open, it is considered an opening. So in this situation, this container was stuck between two potential openings and probably isn't going to be successful. The solution in this one might be to make sure that window is sealed and it cannot be opened, and move it away from the Bilco doors, because you're not going to be able to have that same option. And I will also just highlight this one here is it's not very hard to relocate a dryer vent in an effort to potentially maintain these separation distances. So there's a potential that dryer vent has been terminated and closed off on the inside, but to avoid having a hole in the vinyl siding, they left the termination up there. So it's not just a quick spot sometimes. A little more investigation may have come, because just from my personal experience, the fact that the effort may have been put down to this window, I'd be very quick to verify what exactly is going on with that termination, to see if that is going to create a challenge for us. And again, we're not looking at experts in this class. We're looking at, hey, just something to draw some attention that could be reviewed or suggested to the homeowner to have reviewed by the provider to make sure they're good.
Dave, is there any requirements for cement pad? I mean, I've seen them on stones and wood and pavers. Is there any requirements for these tanks as far as what they should be resting on?
The first thing I'll answer your question is these containers are designed. These, when we're seeing here against the house, are obviously designed to be in this vertical orientation, because of the fact that the vapor space is going to be located in the liquid space. So these have to be oriented so they're in the vertical position, so the valving and the appurtenances are in the vapor space and not the liquid space. So the first definition is they're going to have to be on a firm foundation so they can't tip over. Interesting enough, again, without making this a propane class, DOT cylinders have one regulation which talks about they have to be on a foundation. The ASME containers have a little more definite, says they have to be on a non-combustible surface as well. Having said that, you're generally going to see them on some sort of a non-combustible surface, like a pad, a concrete pad, or blocks, or whether it's one container or the other. So again, if you notice that they weren't that, or if they're tilted or leaning, that might be something that can be brought to the attention, because obviously the foundation has changed on them. Another great question, unfortunately not a yes or no answer. Sorry. All right, I actually see we're getting, moving along here, so I hope we still have all the attendees that started with, but I'll give you one other quick little commentary here is that the pressure in the propane container is going to vary based on the temperature. Depending on how hot or cold out, the pressure is going to change, which obviously is a challenge because you can't have appliances that work at different pressures. So propane systems, similar to natural gas, are regulated. And then you see in these pictures here, you'll see this green regulator, the device here, which is actually a second stage regulator. So propane systems all are regulated in 2 stages. They're regulated to go from container pressure down to the first stage, which is 10 psi, which brings it more in closer to the realm of natural gas systems across the country. But at the actual entrance point to the house or the second stage regulator, and here, because this is a generator, the appliance is actually the exterior. But the second stage regulator is going to take the pressure in the first stage of 10 psi and take it down to probably about a half psi or 14 inches of water column. That's, not a significant amount of pressure. It's actually double, if not triple, what most natural gas appliances work on. But the reason I bring that up is these regulators that are installed at the second stage, right before the appliances or at the entrance to the house where the piping goes in, there's also some separation distances required for the regulators when it comes to source of ignition. And these pictures show this regulator by the generator, it actually has to discharge 5 feet away, potentially. So there'd have to be an extension put on the vent of this regulator. In this situation, which is interesting, it was 2 houses on the same property. One was a guest house. On the larger generator for the master house, the regulator was actually piped away to the back of the electrical panel. So they moved it away from the source of ignition. Unfortunately, they didn't move it away from the power panel, which is also a potential source of ignition. So the thought process was right. The end result just didn't quite get where we wanted to be. But back to our maybe friend over here that said, hey, there's no way propane moving with the wind is going to move around this edge here and come around. In this picture, I guess they thought that if it discharged here, there's no way it'll make its way back to the other side potentially. But that's the kind of things we see out here. We're getting, closer to the end here. Scott, thanks for stealing all the thunder here. Electrical meters can, create some challenges as well. As a rule of thumb at my company and in the Northeast, more and more people are questioning electrical meters. So we've made it a company objective to make sure that our installations are moved away from electrical meters. And it's not just the electrical meter, because I'm sure most of you are running into a lot more solar installation. The electrical meter itself is starting to become a very, very busy place, as well as with the latest edition of the International Fire Code. They're now going to require in NFPA 70, the electrical code, that there is going to have to be a full house disconnect also now on the exterior of the house for responding emergency agencies. So we all know it's going to end up probably in the same area as the electrical meter. So whereas the argument can go on for years, and probably will in regards to the electrical meter itself, whether it's a source of ignition, the main disconnect for the entire house, which is going to start to show up, is not in question. It is absolutely a source of ignition if it's thrown. So that was just one example we've thrown in here as part of the conversation, because again, containers that are installed on the outside of the house draw the attention. You'll notice in this one picture, there is a potential building opening far enough away on the right-hand side, but I'm sure everybody recognizes what's in the middle there. That's actually going to be the chimney. So what's not visible in this question is there any clean out if it was a fireplace, which again, someone may consider a source of ignition. A building opening, I apologize. So not visible in this picture, but obviously if we were doing a walk around, we may draw some attention. And just to sort of wrap us up here, this is unfortunately what happens in our industry. You get to have the fun with looking at installations where the question is are these in compliance or not? And what's interesting here is, whereas we talked about the top of the container having to measure for building openings, you'll see in this situation that someone may have really skirted right around the code and said, hey, we're just below it potentially. Common sense would say this is probably not a great installation. It may be code compliant, but it may not be safe. In this picture here on the right, I've used this before to talk about, people said, hey, these containers are too close to the window, but is that window a building opening? And obviously it's you can't tell 100% for sure, but that window's not opening. So it's not. The other part of this picture is do we have our 10 feet of separation from our obvious direct vent appliances and our compressors?
So it's 3 feet out from the top of the regulator for the opening?
It's going to be from the relief valve in the container, which would be technically the relief valve is going to be probably on the curvature of this container here, because the over here this is just protection for the valve and that stuff going on there. So the relief valve technically is probably at this level right here, if you can see my mouse, which is going to be probably one vinyl siding down. But this is obviously intakes into the boiler room. This is your dryer vent. I will tell you that when we come to fill these containers and we're discharging the propane, some of it is going to go in this direction. This to me is, it might technically be a code compliant, but to me it's a dumb installation. This was easier. It's definitely
David,
not 10.
how is it code compliant? I thought because the vent's lower than the.
Because the vents are higher than the relief. So when building openings, you go horizontally across the level of the relief valve and then down to the ground. So this is the area that technically is not supposed to have a building opening, and you're skirting that right really close here.
Okay.
Okay. And again, even though these containers back here are a little smaller, this building opening, if it was a window, might be in here, but I use this one to talk about picture windows that, just because you can see through it doesn't mean it can allow gas to transfer through. But again, looking here, you've got all your disconnects for your air conditioners. You've got your motors here, and you've got these one direct vent appliance at least going in here. So
if it's a fixed pane, you're fine as long as you can't open it.
Absolutely. Again, if it can't be open, and again, if it had the ability to open, but was then secured that it could never be opened and sealed. But again, can you tell that from the outside? That's where we encourage our employees that they have to go in and check what's going on the inside. And that may be something this group, may pick up on. This pictures aren't really relevant, but I just put it out there to show you that even though a lot of people think propane can be very dangerous, it's amazing what people do around them. And just real quick, this is an installation where these are underground containers that were installed above ground, which is a problem. But on top of that, they're put right up against a building. So it's amazing what you find out there. This was an installation at a casino, and we're just using this to say this is where they decided to park the monster lifts. And because it fit right above the propane containers, they parked it here. The only thing is this connection right here is actually, interesting enough, is tied to the liquid. If they would have broke this off, they'd actually have a liquid leak here, which would be a problem. So we threw these in on another presentation to draw some attention. And we also threw this one in that some people, think that there's too many containers here. But interesting enough, they're not up against the building. So the rules that we were talking about don't really apply to this installation because they're not really up against this building, although it's tough to tell in the picture. But that's more for the real advanced class. The one thing that we talked about real briefly in the last presentation before we wrap it up here is we did talk about the fact that, if for some reason you were doing an inspection and you actually notice the smell of a propane or natural gas, the odorant that's added to it that smells a lot like rotten eggs, from a safety perspective just for yourselves, you may recognize that you may come across an appliance that potentially could be leaking. So we just put down that on propane containers, they all have a shutoff valve that looks just like a water spigot. In piping systems, there may be quarter-turn shutoffs in line that may be accessible. And in the natural gas industry, obviously, there are some different places. Not trying to train everybody here to know what to do to shut off propane or natural gas systems. event of the fact that you're entering people's houses, you know, there are a variety of different things that I'm sure you guys take into perspective from a safety perspective. I just wanted to share the fact that, again, if you did notice the smell of rotten eggs or a sulfury type of smell while you're doing an inspection where the fuel supply is in the natural gas or propane side, you actually may be sensitive to something you've been desensitized to. So I guess that's my industry safety blurb, I guess, my soapbox, that you just never know what you're going to find out there. So,
David, we do have a question.
Excellent.
Do fill covers need to be tight or just placed on top good enough? This gentleman's saying the local company leaves them loose.
So you may have noticed, and I'm assuming we're talking about the lids that we're seeing in some of the pictures. So they're not required. They're just really to prevent from the elements. Technically, and I just want to caution this. So the fill connection is underneath that cover down on the container, and it's also going to have a cap on it. And again, it's primarily for weather protection because the actual appurtenances on the containers are basically being held shut by the pressure in the container. So these lids or caps are really to prevent water accumulation and other elements to potentially get in there that could potentially foul the containers at some point. But those container lids should be closed after the company does it, but it's not going to be a regulation out there. But what's going to happen if they leave it open, water could collect in there. And again, if you're in one of the climates where the water can potentially turn to ice, if again, underneath that cover, the relief valve is going to have a cover to prevent water from getting in there. The fill valve is going to have a screw on top to prevent dirt and in there. This is just another closed.
David, how about grounding of these tanks from electrical strike?
So the propane insulation itself is not required to be grounded or bonded. But interesting enough, when you guys are inside looking at, again, depending on how in depth you look at plumbing, propane piping systems aren't to be grounded or bonded inside the house either, with the exception of corrugated stainless steel tube systems. Very uncommon that they are bonded because they're installed potentially by a plumber or a propane company who don't have that capabilities to bond them unless they bring an electrician in. So it isn't uncommon to find that corrugated stainless steel tube systems may not have the bonding that's required. And again, you hit it right on the head there. It's primarily for a lightning strike. And here's one of those opportunities where being out of compliance doesn't necessarily make you unsafe. The chances of your house being hit by lightning is obviously rare. For that to happen and then create a problem with the gas system that leads to it is also rare. But to your point, it has happened. Therefore, it's been addressed in the code.
Thank you.
But these systems themselves, they're not required to be. Some interior piping requirements may be by the manufacturers of the materials, and CSST is the most prominent one.
Dave, a couple questions. One is, can you smell gas without the tank actually leaking? Well, so, you go buy some of these tanks, can you, is there any, I know sometimes with natural gas, can you get anything from the regulator itself, and that doesn't mean the tank is leaking?
Right. So interesting enough. Right. So there, obviously natural gas and propane is inherently odorless. Therefore, an odorant is added to it. If in a natural gas system, if that odorant is present, it definitely means that there is a leak. What's a little bit interesting about the propane industry is because we are storing the liquid on site, there is an unfortunate part of our industry is the fact that as containers, and I don't have a visual here, but obviously as you use up the liquid propane and it goes to vapor, the liquid level drops in the container and exposes more of the steel of the container. So industry, a regular occurrence is as containers get very close to empty or do run out, the odorant is more common in the gas system, and it can actually escape through the combustion chamber, and it can present the odor inside someone's house at the point of the appliance, and was very commonly expected to be a sign that the container was running low and would need a new fill. And for years, that was a very common industry standard to say, hey, if you smell gas, it's more than likely because you're low, as opposed to a gas leak, because it is actually very rare. However, as building construction has changed, you can't take that chance anymore. So yes, there is a possibility on propane systems that the odorant could be present without a propane leak on that rare situation if a container is actually completely or very close to running out of gas. On a natural gas system, if that odorant is present, it's 100% related to the natural gas escaping from the system. The safest assumption and the is that if you smell that odorant is to assume it's a gas leak and activate the emergency response procedures. But I can tell you that from our industry, unfortunately, that is one anomaly where the odorant may be present, but it's not a threat or a gas. But you can't gamble on that. So we tell everybody, if you smell that odorant, you want to be notifying either your propane supplier or the emergency services. But surprisingly, I think I'm going to run out of time here.
Yeah.
One quick one here. I bought 2 of your Paraco cans for my gas grill. I had them in the back of my van for a short, maybe half hour, 45 minutes or so. When I pulled it out, all I kept hearing is popping noise. What was that? Crack, pop, like from the tank. The tank was making actually a popping noise inside. You could hear almost like, was the gas expanding, or what was it?
Yeah, I can't say 100% for sure because I wouldn't expect that. Hopefully, what we're not talking about is the relief valve popping, because the containers that you
heard the tank like almost like inside the tank itself. It just heard like a little popping noise. It was warm. The tank was warm.
You got me there. Because normally it's going to be just state you're not going to hear something with it. I can't answer that.
Never heard it.
Yeah, something's interesting there for sure.
It was warmer, so it did heat up a little bit.
Well, it's an idea.
If it is warming up, obviously the pressure is going to increase. The nice thing about it is those relief valves are set way above what they can get to. Plus, the containers you bought are slightly underfilled because of the exchange process. But that's interesting. I would probably think that there's more than likely there might be a part of a valve that's broken off at some point through the life, and if that moving around, and there might have been actually what you may have been hearing potentially as you were moving them. But you got me for that one. I'll have to come by and check it.
Well, David, thank you very much for your information. I know as home inspectors in Connecticut, the propane tank is not in our standards of practice, but it's something that we do come across, and it's great to have this knowledge, because we can go above the standard if we want and include them. But this has been very helpful, and I thank you for your time. And we'd love to have you back sometime in the future.
Well, I appreciate it. It was a little more interesting doing it through the virtual method. I apologize if it couldn't be a little more interactive. It looks like we had 25 attendees that started, and it looks like they're still here, so that's a good sign. So
we had pretty good turnout. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave, and
thanks, Dave.
Have a safe stay. Hopefully, the alarm doesn't go off again.